Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Examine Life with Phil. This week I'm going to be playing you part 2 of my interview with Peter Rasor on his book, The Controversy of the Ages, Why Christians Shouldn't Be Divided About the Age of the Earth, and the title of that book is extremely self-explanatory, so I'll just be playing you part 2 of that, and we'll get into a bunch of more details on that. But before I get into that, I want to do another Facepalm and Sigh Award of the Week. And actually, I think I'm going to just rename these like Facepalm and Sigh Awards, because I don't do one every week, so it kind of doesn't make sense to keep calling it of the week. So anyhow, this one is particularly egregious. In fact, I think I might even want to label this one like a double Facepalm and Sigh award. There's a meme that you see go around on the internet sometimes called Double Facepalm and Sigh, and it shows Captain Picard and Commander Riker of Star Trek both with their face in their hands like, oh dear Lord, how can somebody be this dumb? Well, anyhow, this one is pretty much that bad. It really is very, very awful. So I'll just go ahead and play you a clip, and just to set it up, the person talking here is Beto O'Rourke, who's one of the lesser Democratic presidential candidates. So here's what he has to say.
To be clear, you are free to believe anything that you want to in this country, to associate with whom you please, to practice your faith as you best see fit, but you are not allowed to discriminate against people in this country, to violate their civil rights or their human rights.
So I hope you heard that there. Is this one I'm going to have to, invent like a new category for this segment or something, because he somehow managed to contradict himself in one sentence. So maybe I should take a cue from that Star Trek meme and call it something like the Double Facepalm and Sigh Award, for when you somehow defy all reason and sense and manage to contradict yourself in one single sentence. Now, we're all human beings. We all make mistakes. We all say contradictory and do contradictory things from time to time. I've been called out for some of the contradictory things I've said from time to time. But it's really quite an accomplishment to do that in one single sentence. So now, in case you missed it, I'll just explain in detail what the contradiction here is. He's trying to say, at the start of this clip, that you're free to follow your religion. Free, I think he would even go so far as to say free in an absolute sense, because elsewhere he's called it a fundamental right to have religious freedom. But you don't have that fundamental right anymore when it contradicts, say, same-sex marriage. If you don't want to support same-sex marriage, then as far as he's concerned, you don't have that fundamental right. But you see, that would mean it's not a fundamental right. If it's fundamental, it's at the very basis, and nothing else can come against it. And so he's said at the start, hey, you've got your religious freedom. And then at the end he's like, but no, you really don't. And that's why it's a contradiction there. Now, as I like to do when I do these things, if we wanted to interpret him in an ultra charitable way, you could kind of say, well, maybe he thinks there's like a paradox or a impasse between these two things. That is, okay, let's be a lot more charitable than we should be with someone who contradicts themselves in a single sentence, and say maybe what he actually means is that religious freedom is a fundamental, and the freedom not to be discriminated against is a fundamental, and so he sees those two coming into conflict. And if that is the case, then the obvious answer would be, well, this is a difficult issue, I'm not quite sure what to do, here's a few ideas, or, try and work it through with some nuance and clarity, because if it is a clash of two fundamentals, then it should be at best very, very difficult for us to figure out what to do. That's some of the best areas in ethics to study are where two fundamentals clash and it's not very clear what the right thing is to do or what the wrong thing is to do. I talked about some of the gray areas like that way back in episode 15 when I talked about abortion, because it seemed to me that, at least in some cases with issues relating to abortion, you could say you have two fundamentals that are coming into opposition there, which is you have the fundamental of the mother's right to her life and the fundamental of the child's right to their own life. And in some circumstances that are rare, those two seem to come into conflict. So what do? Well, it's really difficult. So, if we interpret O'Rourke very, very charitably, we could say that what he's seeing is a conflict of two fundamentals. But I really don't think that's what's going on, because he says that religious freedom is a fundamental, but then out of the other side of his mouth he says unless, which means it's not a fundamental. So really what it actually sounds to me more like is he views religious freedom as of second-order importance to the right of people not to be discriminated against. And that's what he actually thinks is the fundamental, is the right of people not to be discriminated against. Because when the two are coming into conflict, at least when he thinks they're coming into conflict, that's what he defaults toward, is I don't want gay people to be discriminated against, so if your church isn't going to recognize same-sex marriage, I want to take their your tax-exempt status away. He's said that elsewhere. Now, obviously, this could easily tie into a whole host of other issues which have absolutely nothing to do with the discussion Peter and I had. But I just had to point this out because he really contradicted himself in a single sentence, saying, yeah, you've got this fundamental right, unless you don't agree with me on same-sex marriage, which is a fundamental contradiction. So it's just kind of mind-numbing to me that people would actually support somebody who speaks this way. And as best as I can tell, I'm not familiar with everything that happens in the country, of course, but I am familiar with a couple of the cases that have been cited as where religious freedom has been in conflict with the right of usually gay people not to be discriminated against. And most of the time, it really wasn't an issue of religious freedom, per se. It was an issue of people not practicing the principle of live and let live. That is, if the person who bakes cakes doesn't want to bake a cake for your gay wedding, go find somebody else. Now, I'm inclined to think if you're running a business, you shouldn't turn away customers. That's a very bad idea. But it's your business. You have freedom of association. So live and let live. You don't want to sell your product to people, you shouldn't have to. And you shouldn't be forced to sell it to them. And if they don't want to buy it from you, great. Live and let live. We used to practice that a lot better in this country, I think, than we do now. And obviously you can't practice live and let live when people are coming to kill you and take away your fundamental rights as a human being. You can't look at somebody who's enslaving other people and go, live and let live. That's a very wrong use of the term. But if it's something like, well, that pizza place said they might not want to cater to a gay wedding. Well, live and let live. They're not taking away anybody's fundamental rights because they don't want to cater a gay wedding. Especially a church that doesn't want to perform same-sex marriages isn't taking away from your fundamental rights, even if you believe the same-sex marriage is your fundamental right, because you can still go to a different church, or you can still go to the courthouse to get it done. It's not like they're the only thing standing. It's not like they're standing between you and your right if you think same-sex marriage is a fundamental right. So to sum up the two other points I just wanted to make about that very briefly are, we should return to the idea of live and let live in as much as possible, because we'll all get along a lot better that way. If somebody wants to go do something that you find morally iffy or wrong, but they're not directly hurting you, your family member, or anybody else in your community or society as best as you can, leave them alone, let them live their life and suffer their own consequences. And also, although I didn't cite this as a fallacy here, it does seem to me that O'Rourke has a very unnecessarily broad definition of discrimination when he thinks that just because a church you attend doesn't want to recognize same-sex marriages, therefore they're discriminating against people. That's ridiculous. That is not discrimination. That's just them practicing their right of free thought and freedom of association. If you feel discriminated against because somebody else disagrees with you, even on fundamental things, then you have the problem, not them. And I would say that to O'Rourke as well. It seems like he has the problem, not the people who are opposing same-sex marriage. At least, that's what I see when somebody contradicts themselves in one sentence because they're scrambling so hard to find a way to talk out of both sides of their mouth. Okay, well, enough of that. let's get back on track, and I'll play you the second part of my interview with Peter Rasor on his book now. And because of where I had to split up the discussion last week, I've actually backed it up about a minute or so into the part that aired last week so you can get the full context of what's going on.
Even your younger creationists would disagree with it and say it's false because they believe in natural selection.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even Ken Ham does, for crying out loud,
Yeah,
right?
I think he thinks all species of dog descended from two dogs that were on the Ark, which my dog is definitely quite a bit different than whatever those two dogs on the Ark would have been then.
Right, yeah, exactly. And even a lot of younger creationists will argue that all your dog types spawned from some sort of just one dog type. You know, and when I say dog types here, I'm talking about foxes, wolves, coyotes, your domesticated dogs, and I mean, throw the whole dog whatever in there. And a lot of your younger creationists are going to argue, well, that actually evolved, and they'll use that word, from a dog, one dog kind, as they would say, that Genesis 1 would refer to with the word kind there. So, yeah, I mean, so even that particular question that you just read for us, younger creationists have to say, well, that's false. You know?
Yeah. It just shows the complexities involved, because that means some young Earth creationists believe in common ancestry of a type to a point, because all current dog types would share that common ancestor. They then just wouldn't say, well, all dog types and all lizards share a common ancestor, like most proponents of Darwin evolutionary theory would propose. And that actually, I think, that's a good transition, because there's another point I came across here, because as you said, evolution is such a complex theory in that it has so many parts, and lots of people, even lots of biological evolutionists, will accept certain aspects of it and throw other aspects of it out. And when I was doing some research on this, on your book and things like that, I came across a quote from a guy who runs a blog called History for Atheists named Tim O'Neill, and he was talking about the Copernican controversy, and he said that while Copernicus and Galileo got the heliocentrism part of their models right, they were wrong in very, very many other parts of their models. And so if we were alive then, it would have been perfectly reasonable to reject it because of all the other problems.
Absolutely.
And that, in a certain sense, I think makes it even more comparable to the evolutionary controversy, because there's so many parts, and maybe, in 200 years, we'll find out, oh, these parts were all right, but at least to us now at the time, it appears there's cause for skepticism of some parts of it, so you can then say, well, maybe some parts of this work, maybe some don't.
Right.
It's all kind of a jumbled mess, so to speak, that you got to sort your way through piece by piece.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians don't have the instruments, if I can use that word, to be able to sift through all that. And I don't necessarily blame this. I'm not saying that in a disparaging way. I say that in more of a way of saying, look, we don't have the time. A lot of Christians don't have the time to sit down and study all the intricate details of all this. And then when you add on their comprehension, my goodness, I remember not too long ago sitting down and saying, look, I'm going to read through Ptolemy's stuff. I have it sitting on my shelf. I got a lot of the old philosophical works of scientists and philosophers, theologians. And I was like, I just want to see what Ptolemy is doing here. I could barely comprehend what he was writing, and that was the Ptolemaic system,
Yeah.
and I've got a degree in philosophy at the PhD level, I mean, it's tough. I had to read it so slowly. I finally I was like, all right, I'm never going to use this anyway, at least not anytime soon. So I at least know where to go if I want to find it. And I put it back on the shelf, and I started reading Augustine, which was much more uplifting and edifying. So, we don't have time to look at this stuff. It's very complex, and even if we do have the time, my goodness, it's very difficult to sift through. Comprehending it is very difficult. And there's another thing that came up into my mind here, too, as you were describing that. There's such a huge misunderstanding with how science works, too. Science doesn't work like, okay, we hypothesize A, B, or C. We go practice it in the lab, prove it, and now it's a theory. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's wrong.
Might do that. You might do that for your junior high science project, science fair project. That's not how science works at all. Not even close. I mean, like you mentioned, when Copernicus came out with his models, and then Galileo after him, and then even Kepler, we have these epicycles, and we have all these other types of things that are false. About the only thing that got right was that it was heliocentric, and that was it.
Yeah.
You know?
And so if you're looking at a theory and it gets one thing right and 99 things false, and you know it gets the 99 things false and you're uncertain about the one, the rational thing to do is say the theory's wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And so, science just does not work like you do 1, 2, 3 steps, and now, bam, there's your conclusion, and it's all settled. No, that's not how it works at all. Not even close.
Hmm. Okay. Well, an instrument or tool you guys went into that for sifting through all this stuff that I really appreciated was you brought up the theological conservatism principle, which you actually
Hmm.
pulled from Galileo. So I've got some notes on that. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I thought I really liked the insight you guys were making there.
Yeah, basically, the basic idea in a nutshell is this. The conservative principle says, look, until you basically have enough, we basically referred to this earlier in the podcast here, until you have
Hmm.
enough information and enough evidence to really overturn a prior interpretation of Scripture, you ought to just continue the prior interpretation of Scripture. Don't overthrow it. So you want to be conservative in your approach to traditional historical understanding, unless you have some really good reasons, evidence, stockpiles, after a period of time. So when we first started writing this book, to sort of illustrate this point, we actually, and we sort of still have this approach in the book. We have this. Okay, here's sort of a time 1, time 2, time 3. As we go through working out this
Hmm.
new understanding of, let's say, heliocentrism in this case. Well, in the first part, there was a sort of caution. Well, there should be on the theological as well as scientific, and that would be applying this Galileo conservatism approach. We'd be saying, okay, here's this new stuff. We never really thought about it before. It looks pretty good, but we're not going to give up our own interpretation of Scripture and perhaps even our own interpretation of science at this time. We're just going to wait, do more study, do more pursuit of knowledge here, and we'll see how this pans out. Then there's a sort of middle period where you have a lot of the people who study this, let's say scientists and theologians, who are like, get convinced of the new interpretation, and they're willing to move on. But maybe the people at the lay level, the average person, they're not as much into science. They don't know exactly all the details. And the same with theology. Okay, apply the conservative principle there and say that you're still going to adhere to the traditional interpretation and approach. And that's totally legitimate.
Hmm.
But then when you get into time 3, that's when you get this sort of, as we would call, from Thomas Kuhn's book, a scientific revolution,
Hmm.
where now the evidence is so overwhelming that you have to reinterpret your understanding of Scripture. And that's what happened in the Copernican revolution. Now we have to reinterpret here that, okay, we misunderstood these passages about the earth standing still and its foundations not being moved, because it's just too obvious now that the earth doesn't stand still. It revolves, it moves, okay? It rotates and it goes around the sun. And so in that third, the conservative principle is no longer really applicable, because now you have so much evidence and it's so convincing that it's time to make that shift, make that change. But the conservative principle basically then says, as a summary, look, stick to the old traditional understanding. That's the way you ought to go. And we're not trying to persuade anybody or push anybody away from such an interpretation. And we shouldn't. And we should be open, especially those who are in the know, to have mercy and grace and acceptance and understanding among those who are unwilling to move from that interpretation to the new one.
Yeah, and I think that's a good principle just for thinking about things in general.
Mm-hmm.
I work in philosophy. I hear arguments for things all the time. Just because somebody gave me an argument for it doesn't mean I should change my mind or change my position.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if it's a really good argument, it should move me a little bit. I need to think about it more. I need to be challenged.
Right.
But I would say it's probably the sign of an intellectually weak mind if the first time they hear an argument, they're like, aha, I'm flipping a 180, because you should almost never do that.
Right.
Maybe there are a few instances where you should do that, but they're pretty rare,
Maybe
especially when you.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. But even then, most people when they tell you their conversion stories, it wasn't like a complete 180. It was like they went through a long process. God was kind of wooing them. The Spirit was flirting might be the wrong word, but I'm sure you know what I'm getting. Yeah. And then there's a certain point where they flip, but it wasn't like it just happened instantaneously. There was a process involved. And I think that for thinking about anything philosophically, theologically, anything like that, there needs to be a process involved. If you change your mind immediately, what's to prevent you from changing your mind immediately back again later? So.
Yeah, exactly right. That reminds me of some theological convictions I used to hold at a younger age, to say like around 20 years old or something. And now it's like, after studying for years on some of these aspects and topics, it's like, I no longer hold that, Well, there's a process, 10, 20, 30 years that I went through, studying these things. And now it's like, okay, yeah, I can't accept that anymore because it's just not scriptural. There's no good philosophical basis for it, whatever. So, yeah, I think you're right. There is this process. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis and his conversion. It's kind of neat to read about his conversion process, because he would admit that, okay, yeah, there's this process, but he said, I was in a car with some friends, and we were on our way to the zoo, and somewhere between my home and the zoo, I became a Christian. But of course, there's a lot of backstory to that.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody in their right mind would be like, okay, yeah, it just happened on this ride to the zoo, bam, became a Christian. No, there was a lot of stuff that went on prior to that, probably years of stuff, and then eventually it was just like, you know what? Yeah, I do believe Jesus is my Savior. It just dawned on him at that time. That's what happened. So, and I think that's what happens with us, and with trying to understand Scripture, trying to understand certain philosophies and things like that as we pursue knowledge. Yeah, I think that happens all the time, and it's a process.
Yeah, I could agree with you more. And as an example of that, I'd say you said we need to hold charity for the people who aren't willing to come along. I can think of, I changed some of my theological beliefs about eschatology as I've been going through things. And so, like, I've been talking to people who still hold the same beliefs I used to, and say, well, here's these 2 or 3 arguments that made me change my mind.
Yeah.
And they're not convinced. But you know what? It took me a year or two to change my mind after I first heard those couple of arguments. So why should I then, get upset that they're not changing their mind immediately just because I'm convinced these are really good arguments, especially since it took me so long to recognize, oh, yeah, those are good arguments.
Yeah, well, it reminds me, several months ago, you had me on your podcast to talk about Molinism. It took me 5 years to work through Molinism and conclude that, Molinism is a pretty good, viable position here, and I like it, and I'm going to stick with it until something else better comes along, and in a way to understand God's providence, human free will, etc. And so that's when I became a Molinist. Is like, I've spent 5 years on this stuff, reading about it, thinking about it, and just recently, earlier this year, I came to a different theological conviction on a particular issue, and I spent over a year studying that, and I didn't make it easy. And to be quite honest, there's still sometimes I think about it as like, do I believe that really? And I'm like, yeah, because I remember this, and all these other reasons start popping to my head again. It's like, okay, yeah, I'm still convinced. It just feels weird, because I come to a different conclusion now than what I used to hold for so long. But yeah, I mean, it happens. And I think it's a good thing. We spiritually mature that way, and we gain knowledge. And so anyway, don't want to prolong that any further than necessary. But yeah, I think, there's a lot of good ways we can illustrate that.
Yeah. And I think I want to talk about that quite a bit, because I think that's a good interpretive tool or rational tool for working through these things. And you guys had a couple of other subpoints in the book that I'll just spell out here or read here for the benefit of the listeners, which is these were the assumptions or rules you got from Galileo on theological conservatism. And the first one was assume biblical inerrancy, but not inerrant interpretation,
right?
Which we've been talking about before.
Right.
Assume the Bible's correct, but don't assume you're interpreting it correctly, because you could be wrong.
Right.
Nature and Scripture cannot disagree if you're interpreting both correctly.
Correct.
And then traditional biblical interpretations govern unproven science. So just because string theory's been out for a while, you don't need to reinterpret the Bible in light of string theory, because that's a very unproven theory, even though some highly intelligent people think it shows a lot of promise.
Sure.
But then proven scientific theory requires biblical reinterpretation. So I guess for an uncontroversial example of that, I'd point to plate tectonics, because I think virtually everybody agrees with plate tectonics at this point. So if you had something that says, and I don't think there is a scripture like this, but if you had one that says the continents don't move or something, well, then you'd need to do some reinterpretation at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, what's actually interesting, since you bring up plate tectonics, plate tectonics is actually a very significant piece of evidence for older Earth.
Yes, I would think so.
Unless you're willing to concede that these plates are moving very fast. I mean, we're talking real fast, to where no life can actually continue to exist if plate tectonics is true. Because, man, and we're talking fast speed here, my friend, if we have a young Earth and plate tectonics coincide.
Yeah, and the only way I've heard them try to get around that before would be to say it like happened super fast all at once, like during the flood or something, but there's a massive amount of problems with that theory as to the amount of chaos and distortion and stress that would put on the surface of the Earth, that almost certainly would have destroyed all chance for life to be here at
even
all.
Noah wouldn't be alive on the ark, okay?
Yeah, exactly.
He's not gonna last long if that were to happen.
Yeah. Okay. The next bit, and this actually comes significantly later in the book, but you guys brought up a three-tiered principle of theology from Albert Mohler Jr., who I've read some of his stuff before, and I really like this approach where he's dividing up beliefs into three tiers, where he's saying the first levels are things that are essential to the faith, so that'd be the divinity of Christ, the existence of God, Christ's death and resurrection, probably a few other things in there, but and maybe some people would disagree with me on this, but I think you would want to keep the first level as small as you reasonably can to be as inclusive as you reasonably can. And then the second level would be things that require denominational and church boundaries, like how you organize church government, or I grew up in a Pentecostal church and now I'm attending the Baptist one. So issues regarding speaking in tongues and other manifestations, or according to some Baptists I've met, possible manifestations of the Spirit. Or even like egalitarian or a complementarian debates on gender roles as to whether you want to have a woman be in leadership in the church. That's going to require you to divide, but I don't think a reasonable person would look at somebody who says, I think women should be pastors in the church. Somebody who doesn't should look at them and say, they're not a Christian for that reason. And then his third tier was things that shouldn't even cause second boundaries, and that'd be eschatology, or what you and I talked about before, like Molinism and other possible solutions to the problem of divine foreknowledge. I think you could, as a Molinist, you would be perfectly okay. Well, you tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you'd be okay going to church with a Calvinist or an open theist.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I would have more issues with an open theist, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to, say they're not a Christian.
Exactly.
I'm not going to do that. So that would definitely be in the category of that third category there, right? I certainly wouldn't want them teaching as leadership, but then we're at the second level, aren't we?
You're still not
now
going
at the denominational level. So now we're switching levels. And certainly, there's going to be different understandings of particular things, like the women's issue. I take a strong stance. I'm a complementarian. Maybe not as complementarian as some other people, right? But again, that's going to be the second level. That's going to be a deciding factor of where I worship and what church I'm a part of. But I think I want to dovetail this in nicely with the prior conservatism principle, at least a part of the conservatism principle, and that is, let me say it this way. Why is it, and I'm going to pose it as a question, why is it that it seems to me a lot of Christians have a difficulty with saying, I personally or anybody else personally can change their interpretation and their understanding of a particular theological point because of reading and studying of Scripture or whatever? Why is that a problem? It seems to me that a lot of people think that's a problem. It's almost as if once you become a Christian, and like maybe in your early years of Christianity, you learn these things or whatever, and now you're solid and concrete with everything you believe, and you can never change. And if you do, all of a sudden, well, you're no longer a Christian. Or, all of a sudden they make everything a necessary doctrine to believe in order to be a biblical Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, that now goes into what we're talking about with this triage here, necessity just to be a Christian, or a necessity at the denominational type level, or a necessity at some other level. I think that's false. But,
Mm-hmm.
To be honest here and very open, back in my early years of Christianity, that's how I used to think.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, another way to say this is that we need to be overcoming our Phariseeism, our legalism. We
Mm-hmm.
need to be those who, I guess it's okay to sort of start out that way. We probably all do, would be my guess.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to spiritually grow out of that and not make every single thing necessary to believe in order to just be a Christian, right? I mean, that's basically what we're saying with this triage. You and I can disagree, let's say, on spiritual gifts, or you and I can disagree on some other aspect of Christianity, but as long as you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, he's God in the flesh, he's the God man, he rose from the dead on the third day, these types of little creedal statements that we get in like 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians 15 and other places in Scripture, as long as we can believe on that core, you and I can work together on a lot of stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to consider you a Christian. I shouldn't be sitting here throwing you under the bus because you disagree with me of whether or not, someone can speak in tongues or someone has a word of prophecy or something. Now, I may disagree with that. Just because you believe that, and I think I can work with you in some Christian capacity, doesn't mean I give up my own position on that. And that somehow I'm a compromiser of my own positions and theological convictions. No, it doesn't mean that at all. It just means that I see that there's a priority here of what's important, absolutely important versus relatively important. And so that's why I think we put this triage in there. And in regard to the book, the age of the earth should be in that category of eschatology.
I think so too. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't be in a denomination where it says you have to be a young earth creationist in order to be, Baptist, be, Assembly of God or whatever. It shouldn't be that way. I think this is an issue that needs to be in that third tier, the very bottom, because this is an issue where most people, I would venture to say, don't even have any understanding or any kind of way to even converse intelligently about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
yeah. Yeah. And I would also add that I think with a few exceptions like what you just noted, I think we could even allow for disagreements between what should be considered a second or third level issue. And or like not based on stuff you guys have in the book, but other things I've read by Moeller. I think he tends to put Scripture in the first category of essential of the faith. And to some extent, I'd agree, but I think what he means by that is much stronger than what I want to mean by that, which goes back into inerrancy and stuff.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't then turn around and say, well, because Mueller is having this higher requirement of this than I want to, he's not a Christian.
Absolutely. Yeah,
even though we disagree as to how you should categorize it, like I'd want to put, if we had to break it down by numbers, I'd want to put like the authority of Scripture at like 1.5 instead of 1 or 2, because it doesn't, in my mind, fall down to a second level thing, but it's not quite at the same level as, say, believing in the divinity of Christ and the resurrection and death of Christ and things like that. But Moeller wants to put it at 1. Well, I'm not going to turn around and say, well, you're not a Christian, even though we've got this theological disagreement as to where the priority there goes.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I would agree with your perspective there on that particular point. I put the authority of Scripture, I would probably phrase it differently to put it in the category 1. I don't know if I would necessarily demand that someone believe in inerrancy like I do in order to be a Christian.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. But I would definitely say they have to believe in Scripture in an authoritative sense enough to know that, okay, it gives us historical reliability of who the Messiah was, that it's giving us clear indication that he died on the cross for our sins and stuff like that. Now, all the jots and tittles, now we're getting into inerrancy and how I see it versus somebody else, right? And I don't know if I would demand that from somebody just to be a Christian. but I certainly would demand that it is at least giving us correct, historical, reliable information about Jesus, right?
Oh
And the
yeah,
message
yeah.
of salvation, that God's our creator, and sin and redemption and stuff like that. But, if someone sort of falls over, well, I think Genesis 1 is teaching 7, literal days of creation, but I'm a theistic evolutionist. Am I going to say, oh, well, no, you can't be a Christian now? No, I'm not going to do that. I'm just
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
you know?
That's a much better way of putting what I was trying to say there, because
Yeah,
as you're saying, clearly you have to have at least enough trust in it to believe what it's telling you about Christ's death and resurrection and other
yeah,
fundamental theological things. But you don't, I don't think you necessarily, to then be a Christian, have to then turn around and say, like, it's without error and everything. Like, I was talking to a guy who been in the church and been in Christianity and then had some troubles and walked away, and he was talking to me about all these issues and things like that. And
hmm,
one of the things he brought up was contradictions in the Bible. And I said, well, suppose I give you some of these. What does it prove? Like, a common one that I like to point to, because it gets brought up sometimes, is some people think that there's a certain section in Kings where it's talking about the geological measurements of a certain building and it gets the
oh,
math wrong.
yeah,
And I've heard apologists argue, well, no, it doesn't. But I'm like, well, okay, let's suppose it does. What does that prove? It
yeah,
doesn't prove Christ didn't rise from the dead. It doesn't prove there's no Trinity or any of these other things.
yeah.
So you could well believe that the author of Kings got the math wrong and still be a Christian, still follow Christ.
Yeah,
So
you could. Yeah, you definitely could. And certainly I don't want that to be an obstacle to somebody
exactly, yeah, yeah.
who's an unbeliever from being a Christian. If I have to demand from somebody, oh, you have to believe in all inerrancy and it's all true and none of it's contradictory and none of it's false and da 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 da, in order to be a Christian, I'm sorry. It's much more important for me to believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Lord, their Savior, first and foremost.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
got to be the first. Then after that, let's talk about what these supposed
Hmm.
contradictions are,
Yeah,
and all
yeah.
these other difficulties and questions you got about the scriptures. But as long as you can at least accept the Bible as good and trustworthy, as a good history book
Hmm.
that we use today as textbooks, hey, I'm good.
Yeah,
Let's get
exactly.
let's get you to believe in Christ and save your soul. And then we'll
Yeah,
deal with all this other stuff. Um,
you might
that's
say
that's
it's,
my
go ahead.
approach.
Yeah, you might say it's like a first order and a second order salvation priority, which is first let's
Yeah,
get you to Christ, and then let's deal with all these other things,
yeah,
which if you don't deal with, they're going to cause you problems theologically and spiritually later. But
right.
first, let's get you to Christ, and then let's worry about all these other minutiae and details. And as necessary, God will help you work through them in time. At least He certainly has with me.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Now, on the other hand, if this is an obstacle for them to become a Christian, then obviously you're going to have to address the issue up front,
mhm.
and say, well, let's talk about it. But yeah, I don't want that to be an obstacle in order to become a Christian. And it's the same with the age of the earth, right? I mean, if someone thinks that the Bible is teaching a literal 6-day creation, but yet this person believes in totally, the whole Darwinian evolutionary paradigm, and that's the only thing hanging him up from becoming a Christian, let's get rid of that obstacle,
Mhm.
you know. And my approach would be, look, you don't have to take that as a 6 literal day interpretation. And what it teaches, it is correct. The question is, what is it teaching? And there are different ways to understand this text. And we can talk about this more at some other time, but you don't have to believe the Bible's teaching that, you know,
Yeah,
in order to become a Christian. And even if it is, if you're convinced that it is teaching a 6-day creation, and you want to maintain believing in theistic evolution, okay, let's talk about that later. That shouldn't stop you from becoming a Christian.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And it did seem to me that, like, well, obviously it's in the name of your book, but the central point of your book is we shouldn't let the age of the earth divide us as Christians, which is
Hmm.
exactly what we've been talking about now. But I found, and we got into this earlier, a little bit at least, that a large part of the problem is there seems to be a gross failure on the part of many people to recognize the distinction between their own interpretations and what the text says, because uh, it's a fact of the matter that every time we read a text, we are interpreting it. Like, even as you and I are talking together, we're interpreting each other's words.
Hmm.
But the advantage of us talking here is if you say something and I say, well, I heard you say this, and you can go, no, that's completely wrong. Here's what I meant.
Right, right.
And
You can clarify.
it's harder to do that with texts because the author isn't there for us to, well, in some sense, God is there for us to talk to, but the
Well,
author, the Genesis isn't there. So what I've found is, I don't know if you were aware of this, but Thomas Aquinas actually said something about this. I came across this when I was doing my own research on its inerrancy, which is very much in line with everything you said. He said that, and he was actually referring back to Augustine, that first of all, we need to hold to the truth of Scripture without wavering. But the second is that since Holy Scripture can be explained in a multiplicity of senses, one should adhere to a particular explanation only in such measure as to be ready to abandon it if it is proved with certainty to be false, lest Holy Scripture be exposed to the ridicule of unbelievers and obstacles be placed to their believing. And, you know, he said this long before there was even any hint that of old Earth creationism or evolution, long before. And that's a
12th, 13th century here.
I
think it's 1200s, right?
I think so, but I have a hard time remembering the dates he lived without looking them up, even though I read him all the time. So
yeah. Well, you know, I'm the same way. I love Aquinas. So.
Oh yeah, he was an absolute genius. So, and the other thing is, as I said, I wrote an essay on inerrancy, and you can tell me what you think about this. I presented one at this essay at the Society for Pentecostal Studies earlier this year, and what I find is that it's often the case that in contemporary society, let me back up. First of all, we all have lots of people have different understandings of inerrancy that are often contradictory. Like, you consider yourself an old Earth creationist and you believe you're treating the Scripture as inerrant. Well, Ken Ham believes he's treating the Scripture as inerrant, and he vehemently disagrees with you. So clearly you have different understandings of inerrancy, and that's across the board, not even when the disagreement is that high. But the other point that I thought of is, and this I think could possibly tie into what's going on in Genesis, is I think we often impose a contemporary understanding of error back on Scripture, because when you look at how it was written, like in ancient Hebrew, they didn't write the vowels. You look at ancient Greek, they didn't have quotation marks or ways of indicating quotations, and often didn't have spaces between the words and things like that. It just wasn't written with the same precision that we now do things. And
no, you're exactly right.
There's a lot of things that if I'm writing an essay and I give it to a conference or something like that, or send it off for publication, if I do that, they're going to strike it down as an error, where the biblical authors did things like that all the time and thought it was just fine.
Right. Yeah, I think you are correct. And I think, you know, Cable and I, we explicitly state in our text that we think the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy, that statement, although very lengthy, I think it does a good job at explaining some of that. There's actually some points within that statement that say exactly what almost you said, in almost the exact same way. And I think what is key here is authorial intent. And what did the author mean when he wrote it? Exactly. How was he using the language when he wrote it? I think that's the key idea here. Not the only idea, but a key idea. You know, when you say Ken Ham holds probably a different understanding of inerrancy than I do, I guess I would want to pry that statement, you know, look a little more in detail what you mean by that. Because, yes, in one sense perhaps, but no in another sense perhaps.
Oh.
I would say no in one sense because he would, at least I would think, say he believes in authorial intent, right? I mean,
I would hope so, yeah.
It would seem to me he would. And so that's what's key here, or at least one of the keys in understanding the word day in Genesis 1. What was the authorial intent there? What was meant by that word yom in that particular context by the author who wrote it? And I think Ken Ham would say the same thing. Now, so in that sense, I would say we think inerrancy is the same thing, right? Because Moses, assuming Moses wrote it, right? I don't see why we should question that.
Yeah, I don't see a reason to question that either.
So assuming Moses wrote that, I'm asking, okay, what did Moses mean by that? And I think Ken Ham's asking the same thing. Now, how do we come to the same different conclusions? Well, we're using different hermeneutical interpretive modes is what we're doing. That's what we're doing. So we're not, I don't think, using or understanding the theology of Scripture differently. I think we would agree with that in one sense. but we're using different hermeneutics. We're using different approaches to the text. Even though we're both saying we want to find the authorial intent, use it in context, find the Hebrew meaning, the way we're approaching it is still different. Our interpretive process is still different. That's what's causing us to come to different conclusions.
I see.
Yeah.
So
that's how I would say it. Now, interestingly and ironically, he is using a different definition of interpretation or inerrancy, because they have actually come out with an additional section that they want to add to the statement of the ICBI statement of inerrancy.
Yeah, you guys mentioned that in the book too.
Yeah. So in another sense, you're right, because they want to add young Earth creationist interpretation to that statement. And so, yes, he's already coming to the text now in one sense without really even having to interpret it anymore, because now it's a statement of theological orthodoxy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for me, it's not.
Okay.
So now we are looking at it in inerrancy differently. So in another sense, you're right.
Okay.
Did you see what I'm getting at?
I think I see what you're getting at. So the sense in which you're saying I'm wrong is more interesting. So let me go back to that. Okay. If I'm understanding the way you were phrasing it correctly, and here you can correct my interpretation if I got you wrong. If you think of inerrancy as kind of like a formula, what you're saying is you're plugging in different data than Ken Ham is. And so even though you're using the same formula, you're coming to different conclusions.
We have a lot of the same data, but we're coming to a different conclusion with the same data.
Oh, okay. That's a little more complicated then.
Yeah. Well, let me give you an example. The word yom, right? He's saying, look, here's the data. Here's where yom is used in the Old Testament. And then he concludes, every time the Old Testament uses the word yom, it's always in connection with ordinal numbers. And so therefore it always means 6, a 24-hour period. Okay. Mm-hmm. I look at the same data and I say, well, wait a minute. What about this particular text over here, which doesn't connect it with ordinal numbers, and it actually means something greater than 24-hour period? So I would actually come back and retort and say, it looks like you're cherry picking, because there are actually texts that you're ignoring that shows that yom is used in the context. And you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so
yeah. Mm-hmm.
There are some pieces of the evidence that I think are left out. I don't know if it's intentional. I can't judge that, right? That goes to motive. Only God can judge that. But there's definitely some data, I would argue, that's being left out in analyzing the data in order to come to a conclusion. So, and I would also add some things in there that I think that are overlooked. For example, we have in day 1 light being created. What in the world is that? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you actually to push a young Earth creationist, no matter who it is, what is that? Because there is no light like the sun and stars and stuff like that until day 4. You're going to get a numerous number of examples or answers. No one knows what that light is. I mean, what is that? And then we don't have, and how can you have days until, when there's no Earth rotating around the sun until day 4? I mean, yeah, okay, you can have an answer to that, but you're going to get numerous different answers depending on the young Earth creationist you ask, So there's a lot of data that's also not approached. It's not addressed. And so we are using a lot of the same data. We're still all trying to approach the same text, but we're using different data. Sometimes we're ignoring data. And I don't want to lay all the burden here on the young Earth creationists. I'm sure there are some old Earth creationists, and I would even argue definitely some theistic evolutionists who aren't including all the data, who aren't including all the theological questions and trying to sift through it all. That's why I think, I don't know, I know I'm biased here perhaps, but I think that my approach to this, I can say, look, you can be a theistic evolutionist, you can be a young Earth creationist, and you can still be a Christian. I don't think you're disparaging and undermining the authority of Scripture here, because we're all coming to this text, we're all looking at the data, and we're coming to different conclusions with this data. Look, and we do that all the time, even in science. I mean, for crying out loud, look at quantum mechanics. You've got all these different interpretations of quantum mechanics. I mean, come on. And now today we're trying to figure out and describe the origin of the universe with string theory, multiverse, and all these other types of things. They're all looking at the same data, but they're all coming and using different models. It's because we're finite human beings. We're sinful human beings. We want to prove what we think, and, I know, honestly, I want to lay those things aside as a Christian and interpret the text as best as I can and not just try to prove what I want it to say. But we all do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's subconsciously or some other kind of consciously going on, we're still all doing that to some degree. And I think that's why we get a mess. So, yeah, we all believe in inerrancy, and perhaps we can even agree, probably Ken Ham and I would agree in one sense with the basic understanding of inerrancy, but we're looking at the data and we're interpreting it differently. And it's just going to happen because, there isn't, it's very unfortunate that fundamentalism has left over for us in a lot of pockets of Christianity that you can just read the text and it means what it says and says what it means. Well, okay, I guess, yeah. But unfortunately, I'm a human being and I'm trying to make sense of this, and I'm bringing to it my own presuppositions, my own assumptions, my cultural baggage, my own family baggage, and how things I've interacted with in my own history. I mean, it sounds great and wonderful to say the text says what it means what it says. I guess in theory, yes, but getting to it is much more difficult than just describing a platitude.
Oh, yeah. That completely ignores the drastic cultural difference that we have between now and those authors who wrote the scripture, right. The time differences, the language differences, and all those other factors which definitely need to come into play to help us determine authorial intent. So yeah.
And it's no different with the question of the age of the universe or in the age of the earth. We're all coming to the same text. We're all coming, at least those who believe in biblical authority, with the same kind of understanding that the scriptures are telling me the truth. We're just trying to figure out what that truth is. What is it actually teaching? We want to know.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's a huge problem when some young earth creationists come along and say, well, you really don't want to know. You just want to conform to society's standards of science and unbelievers or whatever. No, that's not the case at all. I really want to know the truth here. I really am a seeker of truth. I want to conform my will to God's, I really do.
Yeah, that's what I want to do too, which is why I study all these things. So
yeah, absolutely.
Well, it looks like we have gone about through the time. So did you have any concluding thoughts or ways you wanted to wrap up?
Yeah, one last thing here that I would like to put into the ears of your listeners, and that is, if you have taken a particular strong view of young earth, theistic evolution, old earth creationism, I think that's fine, but let's not divide over it.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, let's have some good open dialogue. I think we would possibly come to a quicker conclusion on some of this stuff if we could just be a little more open and gracious and understand that we can be iron sharpening iron rather than taking our swords and trying to stab each other and trying to be some sort of heresy hunter. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
And so that's what I want us to do. And it doesn't go just for this particular topic, the age of the earth. It goes for a lot of theological topics. And I think it's time to put aside the leftover residue, if you will, of the modernist fundamentalist controversy of the early to mid 20th century and realize, look, we can be spiritually mature to realize what is essential in order to be a Christian and what are the peripheral issues where we can discuss and have disagreements on. And I think we need to do that across the board, not just age of the earth, but all theological type of questions. And I think we need to discern what those are, what topics those are, and which ones can be up for debate.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. You guys had a great quote in the book that I copied out there on that where it says, liberals have never met a doctrine worth fighting for. Fundamentalists have never met a doctrine not worth fighting for. Those are the extremes that we want to avoid. Fight for what's essential and have good discussions like we're doing now about things that are non-essential, but don't throw people under the bus because of them.
Right, yeah. Totally in agreement with you there.
Okay. Well, did you have any upcoming projects or things you want to plug as long as you're here?
Oh, no, not really. Just getting ready to finish a book, trying to find a publisher right now. Another co-authored work with a good friend of mine who's a minister at a church in Louisville. But we haven't found a publisher yet. But it has to do with a worldview and practical ministry type issue. So I think that'll be very interesting to lay leaders and just all Christians in general. It's not going to be a very long book, but it's something that we feel passionate about and we're putting together. Don't really want to give away too much information at this point because, like I said, we don't have a publisher yet. We're still looking at this present moment. So, yep.
Cool. Well, hey, if it's even slightly philosophically inclined, if after you get it published, you want to come back and talk to me about it,
Yeah,
That'd be great. So,
absolutely. I think you'll be interested in it. So definitely we'll let you know once we find a publisher for it.
okay, good deal. Okay, so that's the extent of Peter and I's discussion about his book. I read the whole book before interviewing him, and if you're at all interested in these topics, I do recommend reading the book. It has a lot of very useful information, especially the history they go through of the various movements relating to creationism and evolution, and the history surrounding Galileo and Copernicus and the original controversy of heliocentrism, because it certainly isn't controversial now. Anyhow, all that history and details are very useful for helping put context into the discussion that is now going on as far as origins and Christianity and things like that, because it often does seem to me that we tend to lose sight of the greater context of what's going on in discussions like this. So it's well worth your time to read the book. I certainly recommend it, and if Peter gets more book sales out of this, then great. Now, thinking of books, I actually had a friend of mine recommend to me a book by a guy named Malcolm Gladwell, and the book is called Talking to Strangers, and my friend was also kind enough to let me make use of his copy, so I didn't even have to buy one, which was great. Thanks for that, Keith. So, anyhow, Malcolm Gladwell apparently runs the podcast called Revisionist History, which I haven't listened to, but several people have recommended I do. And I went through this book, and it's very interesting, worth your while, and I'd recommend you go through it as well. He's talking about issues relating to how people relate to each other. And he frames it in the context of a traffic stop where a white police officer, I think it was a highway patrolman, pulled over a young black woman and ended up arresting her for what initially started off as, at best, very minor infractions and what most of us would consider like a BS reason to pull somebody over. And so rather than simply writing this off as racism or bad policing or something like that, he tries to pour into the issues of how is it that people talk to each other and understand each other, or often don't understand each other, especially strangers. And he tells a lot of interesting stories in the book that are worthwhile, and that's really the part of the book I enjoyed the most, was all the stories he tells as examples of what's going on. He talks about when Cortez met Montezuma, some various times when the CIA got duped by people, talks about the poet Sylvia Plath and how she killed herself, and how Chamberlain was duped by Hitler. And the common thread he originally starts with is all of these people were strangers when they met. When Chamberlain met Hitler, they were strangers. When Cortez met Montezuma, they were strangers, and so on and so forth. So how did they relate? And he has three general points, which I think are, on the whole, pretty good points, that he ties them all together with. Well, actually, 4 points, but the fourth one isn't quite as fundamental. And those are what he terms default to truth, assuming transparency, and coupling. And then the minor point is issues relating to proactive policing, but that's kind of subgrouped under coupling. And so what he means by these are, well, with default to truth, I've actually talked about this before on some episodes of this podcast. It's kind of the same thing as the principle of charity, which is, I recommend to people all the time, unless you have reason to think otherwise, assume that the people around you are telling you the truth and doing their best to be honest with you. Not necessarily that they're right, but that they're not lying to you and not behaving maliciously. And he's able to cite some data that suggests that actually that is the way most people operate most of the time. But that becomes a problem when you're in a profession like counterintelligence in the CIA, where people are constantly lying to you, or when you're interrogating a terrorist or something like that. And the examples he cites where the CIA got duped and things like that, they were just naturally, what he terms, defaulting to truth, even though there was some cause for suspicion, because the cause wasn't enough to overcome the natural human tendency to default to truth. Now, I heard that and I thought, well, yeah, that's a good point, and probably if you are running a counterintelligence operation in the CIA, you shouldn't be operating from a principle of charity. You should be operating from a principle of suspicion or something like that. You should be convinced everyone is lying to you until you have cause to think otherwise, instead of vice versa. But part of the reason why we have this default to truth or principle of charity is because in our day-to-day lives, that's just kind of how you have to live. Imagine if in your family and friendships, you just assumed every one of them was lying to you until you had good cause to think otherwise. It wouldn't work. It'd be terrible. It's far better to assume in your daily life that people are telling you the truth unless you have cause to suspect otherwise. An example he cited of that was there was one guy, and I forget his name, but anyhow, there was one guy who actually knew from data that Bernie Madoff was running a Ponzi scheme and defrauding a lot of people. And he sent reports and stuff to the SEC constantly, and they just ignored him until eventually they couldn't ignore him anymore, and it all came out. And he was the only one who was right. Other people had suspicions, and they went and met with Madoff. They talked to him, shook his hand, and defaulted to truth. They believed him after they talked to him, even though they had data that suggested something's going on here. You should be suspicious. But Malcolm Gladwell interviewed this guy, and it turns out he's ultra suspicious of everyone all the time, to the point where the example he cited is when he walks in to meet with a doctor, he tells the doctor, I know 40% of medical spending is fraud, waste, or abuse, so you better not do that on me. Well, as everybody who listens knows, my wife is a doctor, and I told her that, and she's like, well, yeah, that statistic's probably true, but very little of that is because of doctors. That's almost entirely due to insurance and administration, other things like that. Very unlikely that your doctor is the one who's committing fraud, waste, and abuse. It happens, but it's rare. And so I hear that and I'm thinking, is that really a good way to start a relationship with your doctor? Walking in and saying, I think there's a 40% chance you're going to try and screw me over. I don't think so. That's a terrible way. You're going to be considered like a problem patient, and it'll be a more adversarial relationship. So the lesson I took from that is probably when we have hard data that suggests that there's something suspicious going on, we should go with that data instead of then going and talking to the person and letting them talk us out of it. That is, if you've got data that suggests this person is lying to you, and they look you in the eye and they seem sincere and they say to you, no, I swear to you, I'm not lying. I'd give the data more weight than what the person says, because there are people who are psychopaths like Bernie Madoff who will just flat out lie to you. And neither, I think, should you be the ultra-suspicious person, like the one guy who was right about Madoff was, because that's not a good way to live. That's not a good way to have relationships. It just doesn't work that way in personal relationships. I don't think it even works that way in business relationships. You have to assume a certain element of trust between people. Now, his second point of assuming transparency is also interesting in that most of the time we assume that people's body language and their facial expressions line up with exactly what they're thinking. And that can work if the person you're talking to is in like the same cultural context as you and kind of like from the same place as you. But he cites some data of people who were studying like remote tribes and things like that. Some of these remote tribes, their face looked completely different than when they were afraid than us Westerners' faces do. The point being, they don't have that transparency. That is, you can't look at them and know what they're thinking and feeling. But all of us tend to operate on the assumption that we can look at people and know what we're thinking or feeling. The common saying is that like 80% of communication is nonverbals. Well, if that person's from a radically different culture or time, their nonverbals might not match up with their verbals, and you might not understand what's going on. One of the examples he cited in this was the case of the American Amanda Knox, who got charged with a murder in Italy. And the reason why the Italian police were onto her is they thought she was acting in a way that a 20-year-old person who's just had her friend brutally murdered shouldn't act. She was acting out in kind of weird ways and things like that. But later, the evidence comes out, and there's one guy who the evidence clearly points her finger at, and it completely exonerates Knox. And the only reason the police were after her is they looked at her behavior and said, it has to be her, because her nonverbals didn't match up with the verbals of what she was saying. The Italian police assumed transparency, and not only was there the cultural disconnect between her being American and them being Italian, but Amanda Knox's friends, as I might be misspeaking about this a little bit, but my understanding is she acted kind of weird most of the time then anyway, and really, I've watched enough documentaries about crime to know you can't depend on how somebody's reacting after a traumatic event. People react in all kinds of weird and unusual ways when traumatic events are going on. You can't look at it and think, well, that's not how I would behave, therefore something's up. No, it doesn't work that way. People are different. Now, and his third point was something he termed coupling, and he tied this into Sylvia Plath's suicide. And making a long story about Plath short, she killed herself by using a certain type of gas that was widely available in Britain when she was there, by putting her face in an oven and turning the oven on. And suicide rates in Britain at that time for gas were really, really high. Well, when they changed to a different type of gas that wasn't lethal, they went way, way down. And he suggests that possibly, although Plath was depressed and had, flirtations in her mind with suicide and death and things like that, you can read her writing to find out that, he suggests there's the idea of coupling, that if Plath hadn't been coupled with being in England at that particular time, when that particular method of suicide was so easy, then she probably wouldn't have killed herself. And he cites some other data that shows he's probably got a good point there. People who had intended to kill themselves by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, some of them got rescued because somebody saw them doing it, pulled them back, or things like that. Well, anyhow, most of them then who got stopped then didn't go on to kill themselves anyway. His suggestion being they were only prompted to do that because they were depressed and they were at the Golden Gate Bridge. Take away the Golden Gate Bridge, they'll just be depressed. They'll probably think about suicide, but they won't have the opportunity, so they won't do it. And where he ties this back into the story, he starts the book on the case of the woman getting pulled over by the cop for essentially BS reasons, is some work that was done in policing and how to do policing. There's a whole long story behind it that I won't go into, but the gist of it was there was a pretty successful experiment in Kansas City, I think about 20 years ago now, where they just got 2 or 3 squad cars, put cops in them and said, this is the section where we have the worst crime and the most gun crime. Every night, go out there, pull people over for any reason you can imagine, and try to search them and confiscate weapons and make arrests if you find any reason to do so. And it was very, very successful in dropping the crime rate because they were going around collecting weapons. They were taking people off the street who were likely to cause problems and things like that. And so it dropped the crime rate. And now what he says, and I don't know if there's data to back this up because I haven't done any other research on this, but what he says is police departments took that and they learned the wrong lesson. They took that to mean aggressive policing solves problems. If we're just hyper-aggressive in policing, that is, pull people over for a broken taillight and then keep talking to them, look for any excuse to search the car and hope you find something, that's going to drop crime, because it kind of did in that section of Kansas City. But what the police departments across the country have apparently failed to realize is, and this is according to Gladwell here, that worked very well in that one section of Kansas City because they were doing it pretty much in the middle of the night in the worst crime-ridden area of the city. And so they went to the place where they knew people would be looking for trouble and started using any excuse they could find to start policing them and getting them off the street. Now, that's not going to work so well when you go to an area with very, very low crime, because odds are there the people aren't on their way to commit a crime. They're just on their way to the grocery store or a job. In this woman's case, she was coming back from a job interview, and so on and so forth. So what you actually end up doing is, in a sense, harassing citizens who aren't really doing anything wrong, just for minor nuances that don't really matter, like this person was going 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. Technically a crime, but is that something that we should really be policing heavily? No, of course not. And so that's kind of how he ties it in. It is, at the end of the book, he has a whole little thing where he explains all this and ties it back together. He says that the police officer in this particular case did not default to truth because police have been training their police officers not to do that, but to look for any signs that somebody's lying and jump on that. And that probably is appropriate, like in that original Kansas City example where they were in the worst crime area of the city, because odds are somebody there was a criminal who was lying to them. It's not appropriate if you go to a suburban area with regular houses and, families of 4 or 5 people where almost all the parents are there, because odds are you're not going to run into much crime there and the people are going to be telling you the truth. But if you've ever dated somebody unreasonable, as I did in the past a long time ago, then you know that no matter what you say or how you say it, if the other person is determined to doubt you, determined to think you're lying, they're going to find a way. And again, probably appropriate to think that way and operate that way if you're the CIA running counterintelligence. Might be appropriate to think that way if you're a police officer running the night shift in the worst crime-ridden part of the city. Not appropriate to think that way on a routine traffic stop because the odds are very, very high that the person is going to be telling you the truth. The second point of assuming transparency tied to this story because the woman involved didn't like cops because she'd been pulled over for other minor infractions like this before and had to pay out something like $8,000 in fines and fees, which, of course, she's not going to want to get pulled over again, even if it was legitimate that she had done something wrong and needed to pay those fines and fees. Who'd want to get pulled over by a cop if that's going to happen to you again? And on top of that, and this ties into the third point of coupling, that is the event linking with the person causing something to happen, the police officer in this case was practicing aggressive policing to the point where he sped up at the woman in question's car. She pulled over to get out of his way, but she didn't signal, so now he had an excuse to pull her over, and that's why he pulled her over. So that's part of the reason why she was frustrated and agitated and acting out, and she was a little disrespectful because there's all this other context going on where she's had to deal with cops doing this kind of thing to her before. The cop actually prompted what caused the pullover, which is if he hadn't been speeding up to her and she hadn't got out of the way, as she's supposed to, then this wouldn't have happened. So, it's a pretty good, interesting book. He makes a lot of interesting points about things to think about. I don't think it's right all the time, like when he talks about context/coupling there, he hyper-focuses on the context of things like Sylvia Plath having access to that gas or the people being at the Golden Gate Bridge. And he does neglect, well, there's another half of the equation there, which is these people really were depressed. They really did have suicidal thoughts. Some of them had reasons for that and so on and so forth. And maybe he does that because that's what most people tend to focus on. But it's not like it's only the context or the coupling that and things like that. And same thing with the example of the woman who got stopped, which is, well, yeah, the context did push her in the direction of being disrespectful to the cop and being angry and agitated about what's going on. But at the same time, she still did do that, and it's certainly possible she could have done otherwise. And likewise, the same thing with the police officer. You look at his records, and he was practicing this proactive policing in a place where it didn't belong. And it's likely he was doing that because that's what he was trained to do. But even though he was trained to do it, he's still the one who was doing it, so he still bears responsibility. So some of these things, he brings up some good points, but I don't think it's quite as simple as the book presents it. And I don't know very much about this guy, but from the detail he went into, I'm sure he would give me that if I talked to him. So yeah, good book. If you're looking for something interesting to read that's not too long, check it out. So that's the end of this week's episode. This is the first time I've ever done any kind of book recommendation here on the program, and I'm giving you two of them this time around, both Peter's book and this one by Gladwell called Talking to Strangers. So check them both out, read them, let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about the podcast in general, whether you like it, don't like it. I'm always happy for feedback or questions. You can send me feedback at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. And I've also started a Facebook group for the podcast called The Examined Life with Phil. Just do a search for that on Facebook. It'll pop right up. I try to, throughout the week, post interesting, funny, and philosophically related things on that page, so it's not just me putting up the podcast every Friday, but I do that as well. And finally, if you like what I'm doing here on the podcast, then help it grow. Get it out to more people. Share it on social media. Tell your family and friends about it. Give it a like or a rating on the podcast service you use, whether it's iTunes, Spotify, or whatever, and that'll help get it out to more people. So thanks again for listening, and I will be back again with another one for you next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.